Hello again. So I'm going to talk about ascending sequences today, all in the same video. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the ascending step sequence. Alright, so to begin this one, let's remind ourselves what an ascending step progression looks like in tonal music and where we might expect to find them. So going back to G major, here is our example. So if we look at the Roman numeral and contextual analysis, we might see some things that we recognize here. We have a little bit of an embedded phrase model, predominant, dominant, and a tonic substitute with that 6th chord, where we expect that 5 chord to go to tonic. Get a little bit of a deceptive resolution there. Looks like this is the middle of a phrase, and that would be expanding the phrase from within that deceptive resolution and that tonic substitute. That's what they do. And then afterward, we get a normative, predominant, cadential 6/4, so on and so on, perfect authentic cadence. So then in terms of the ascending step motion, we see it between a 4 chord going to a 5 chord. We see that pretty often. And also, as we described, our deceptive motion with that double tonic pitch, that also gives us an ascending step sort of progression. And then after that deceptive resolution, we essentially get a series of falling fifths. We go from E minor chord to an A minor chord to a D major chord to a G major chord. Notice that none of this is sequential, it's just progressions that we already know and at this point love. Now I'm going to take that ascending step motion and I'm going to cast it into repetition and patterning to see what the sequence looks like. Example here has 2 sharps and it has A natural at the end of it, which tells me D major might be the key we should be thinking about. Now you might notice there's a fair amount of pitch repetition that goes on here. We have oblique motion happening either within the bar line, bass voice, or across the bar line, upper voice. But we can still see a general pattern that's established with a model and a sequential copy and another sequential copy, essentially showing us that everything is going up by a step. And so on and so on. So then if we examine the intervals, we can see the intervallic content consisting of a 5th alternating with a 6th. And that gives us our linear intervallic pattern of 5/6. So that 5th and 6th, those things tell us a lot about what chords are possible. We know that with a 6th interval above a bass note, that the upper note of that 6th is the inversion of a 3rd. So that might be something like a root of a chord. And a 5th above a bass note, we can also understand as a first sort of analytical place to land, as maybe it's a root position chord as well. So if we look at that information, we can see a little bit of a progression that's emerging. So then if we look at this, there's some things that hold constant from other sequence types. We see something being expanded. We see something that's non-functional. We also see some maybe more curious types of Roman numeral things going on. For instance, I wouldn't expect to find a 6/6 chord in too many contexts. I mean, in reality, that's like a tonic chord with a wrong note in my ear. So we also see something like a 7/6 chord, a leading tone chord, in a normative position this time, unlike what we saw before in descending 5th. But in this context, it's not resolving toward a tonic chord. I would expect 7/6 to go to maybe maybe a 1/6 or a tonic chord, scale degree 3 or scale degree 1 in the bass. Instead, we end up moving toward a 3 chord here, which is a kind of tonic substitute. So we can see that all of that is kind of cast within non-functionality. And essentially, this sequence connects point A, a tonic chord, to point B, another tonic chord, and then moving toward that dominant chord at that half cadence. So if we look at the roots of these chord structures then, we can say the root of the first chord is D, then the root of the second chord, B, which goes down a 3rd between those 2 chords. And then moving across the bar line from B as a root to E as a root, we get an ascending 4th. And then falling 3rd again to C sharp, and then ascending a 4th from C sharp to F sharp, falling a 3rd from F sharp to D before the pattern breaks and we land on a half cadence anyways. So this is where we get the A2 minus 3 plus 4. Again, with each one of these sorts of sequential spellings, I'm borrowing Stephen Leitz's method, and I'm essentially going minus first and then plus, just to keep it consistent, regardless of what's going on in terms of the actual baseline. So here, A2 is indicating our interval of transposition. The model is moved up to the first sequential copy, which is moved up by a step to the second sequential copy. So A2, an ascending step, is the interval of transposition. And then minus 3 plus 4 is talking about within the model to the first copy, that harmonic root motion, down a third, up a fourth, even though you notice the bass voice here is not confirming that information. So this is all what we wrap into a concept we call ascending step, or as it's frequently called, ascending 5/6. Which is essentially what this ends up looking like in terms of our linear intervallic pattern at the point that we're looking at here. So then if we flesh this out into 4 voices, we can see a little bit of information that's a little bit clearer in terms of those harmonies. So what we're seeing here anyways is we're still seeing that model moving up a step and then moving up a step again. And the minus 3 plus 4 is holding together. And if you look at the inner voices, because everything is moving up a step and we have so much conjunct motion, we're going to need to employ what Michael Buckler calls skippy voice. And what we adopted when we talked about descending third sequence with that sort of real conjunct outer voice structure anyways. So if you follow from the tenor voice across from measure 1 to measure 2, you notice this sort of relationship. Skip a third, a fourth, a third, a fourth, a third, then it breaks. Well, essentially that's telling us what our minus 3 plus 4 is doing. Those are all the chordal roots that are going on, and that's what's happening here. We just are moving through this sequential patterning, and skippy voice is occupying that lower sort of voice leading strand that's happening here. Now let's return to sort of species counterpoint, and let's look at another example of a different sort of LIP structure. New key signature is 2 flats, doubled B flat at the end of the simple duple exercise. Looks like B flat might be the key we think about to analyze this. And it looks like it might not start with a B flat major chord. So starting somewhere else. Some things might sound familiar. The melody still has that oblique motion across the bar line, so the melody is pretty much lifted from the previous examples. The bass line is different. You might notice it's our friend, Skippy voice, in the bass now. And when I see a real disjunct bass line, or any disjunction in a bass line, in tonal music, I'm expecting it to be some root position motion going on there anyways. So if we look at this, we can hopefully see we still have a model that's created, and then moved up a step, and then transposed up a step again. So our interval of transposition looks like an ascending step. Measure 1 is moved up a step to measure 2, measure 2 is moved up a step to measure 3, and then it breaks off anyways. And if we're looking at the intervals, well, we see a fair amount of perfect consonants here, which gives us our LIP of 5/8 that goes on. And we know that a fifth above a bass note more than likely can give us maybe a root position chord structure. And if we're looking at the rest of this progression to try to make sense of what chords are happening, we can do it by following the sequential expectation here anyways of seeing everything going up a step. So by first recognizing things are going up by step, after that, I advise you to maybe analyze and see if you can make this sort of harmonic structure between roots happen of this minus 3 plus 4. And you might notice that E flat to C is a falling third, C to F is a rising fourth, so on and so on. And then it breaks. So now let's take a second and let's examine some of this counterpoint, because I said there's a lot of perfect consonants here. If you look at downbeat to downbeat, you might look at this as being, okay, this looks like consecutive fifths in terms of what's happening and the onset of each sort of copy anyways. And ascending 5/6 sequences or ascending step sequences, they don't tend to be thought of as consecutive fifths for a number of reasons. One, we have two harmonies that are participating in a pattern, and then that pattern is being moved. So it's not creating the same impact as a direct consecutive fifth or octave might create. Also, that stepwise motion in the melody does a fair amount of, let's say, mollifying to the idea of being cast into consecutive motion, and that oblique motion across the bar line also helps in this context. So ascending 5/6 sequences in a lot of ways might look like maybe a way to avoid consecutive fifths. And in short, kind of, but more nuanced, not really, because it's a really important pattern that's essentially happening with this 5/6 type of thing participating over usually a stationary bass note. But we can see skippy voice in the bass, and it does end up looking like this when that happens. In review, sequences in general are a series of non-functional harmonies that we analyze in parentheses, and they're held together by one interval per harmony, or harmonic change, a linear intervallic pattern, or LIP. Specifically, the ascending step sequence, or ascending 5/6, we're looking at each pattern ascending by a step, by going down a third and then up a fourth in terms of each harmonic relationship. And when that's happening, we might see skippy voice playing a role at some point here, like we saw with descending third sequences. And something I didn't mention here that's a good thing to keep in mind is ascending step in major mode can start on a tonic chord. We saw it start on a 4 chord. And when we see it happening in minor mode, it frequently begins on something like major 3. So it looks like starting on a tonic chord in major mode, but in minor mode it tends to start on something like major 3 and then ascend until it gets to the dominant. So it gets truncated a little bit from the excerpts that we saw. But for the time constraints, I kept it brief for now. So now I move to the final sequence, if you're following these in order. And it's another ascending sequence, so we have 2 that go down, descending 5th, descending 3rd, and then 2 that go up. We saw ascending step, and the inversion of descending 5th. We have an ascending 5th sequence. As before, let's begin by looking at what an ascending 5th gesture looks like. 1 sharp, looks like G major, and we have this progression. So Roman numeral, contextual, cadential analysis show that we have tonic expanded with a non-functional 4/6 chord, which kind of acts as a passing chord, as strange as it is to say, between 1 and 1/6. We're used to seeing things like 5/4/3, maybe passing 6/4, or 7/6, or maybe even 7/6/5 between 1 and 1/6. And instead of that sort of stepwise motion, we now have kind of that sixth between 1 and 1/6 being filled in with a little third, equidistant third, then fourth leaping motion. So that's what 4/6 is doing here. But it's non-functional. It's going toward a tonic chord. And then at the end, we have that plagal extension that we know about already from our extended cadential types discussions. Non-functional again because it's not moving toward a tonic. And we know that PAC happens the first instance of that tonic chord after that dominant chord, after that cadential 6/4 chord is articulated there. So then if we look at this, there's some types of motion that we're pretty familiar with. We do have an ascending step between 1/6 and 2/6, which it's not to say it's sequential, it's just the type of motion that we were talking about. It's a common motion, a strong motion. And then our cadential paradigm is built from falling fifths, 2 to 5 to 1. So then, let's examine what these other things are doing. That plagal motion, that non-functional motion is what I'm going to focus my attention on. And the reason I'm doing that is because an ascending 5th sequence is built from this type of gesture. An ascending 5th is the same as a falling 4th, if we're talking about intervallic inversions anyways. So in other words, ascending 5th sequences are going to sound like a bunch of plagal motion. So we're going to unpack that now in more detail. So taking that ascending 5th pattern anyways, and then casting that into repetition, we start to get a little bit of a semblance of a lot of plagal motion. I've shifted to 2 flats and a more traditional 4/2 meter, and this is what we end up with. So we could probably recognize that there is a sequence that's created initially here. We have a model that's created, and then it's sequenced up a step, which is then sequenced up a step, in which case it breaks. So if we analyze the intervals, it looks like we have a 3-5 LIP, or linear intervallic pattern, that's going on, with the interval of transposition being a step upward, a diatonic step upward. So these thirds and fifths, I see a real jagged baseline. Maybe we're dealing with a bunch of root position chord structures, in which case we might be able to see how tonic is expanded, and then how non-functional harmonies kind of work with this sequence. You might notice that 5 progressing to 2 is not something we would commonly expect. 2 moving to 6, same sort of situation. 6 moving to 1, same sort of situation again. So we don't get a lot of the more conventional motion we get with the inversion of this, descending fifth, where everything can make sense in a sort of context. With ascending fifth, we kind of get a whole different sort of ball game with the motion that is generated. So then if we look a little bit deeper at this, we can look at the root position motion of what's going on. Notice that in particular, if we're still using the minus and then plus system, we can make sense of this in the same way we can make sense of descending fifth, in other words. Descending fifth, we noticed, was -5 plus 4, going down a fifth, then up a fourth. Well, in this concept of ascending fifth, it's the same exact thing, just inverted. Every single harmony is a fifth higher than the previous harmony. So if we're starting on B flat, the next harmony is going to be built off of F. The next harmony after that is built off of C. The next harmony after that is built off of G. So if we're keeping the minus to plus methodology intact with all these sequences, which is what I'm doing, then it looks a little strange to say -4 plus 5 is what's going on here. But that is in fact what's going on here if we're talking about the harmonic roots of what's going on and staying consistent with our other ways that we've identified these patterns. Now, there's a reason I grouped the ascending sequences together. They both have an ascending step look between model and sequential leg afterward. In other words, they both look like they go up by a step from model to sequence, which they do, but harmonically they're generated via different means. While the ascending 5-6 sequence uses a skip down of a third followed by a skip up of a fourth, as we've seen earlier in this video, the ascending fifth sequence just puts a bunch of fifth motion cast into repetition with itself. So every harmony is moving up by a fifth in general. So then building a 4-part harmonic structure and keyboard style from that LIP, we get the full harmonies kind of fleshed out with each one ascending by a fifth harmonically in terms of the root motion. And we'll see that ascending fifth and ascending step both do a really similar thing in terms of when it's cast into minor mode. Again, we would expect it to use natural form of minor to not have functionality of leading tones, and also they frequently both begin on things like a 3 chord. So here's my example with 2 sharps. A sharp also looks like B minor. Pretty weak cadential motion, forgive me, but I mean, it's not my best work. But if we look at the intervals that get created here, it looks like we have an octave moving toward a third, then another octave moving toward a third again, and then another octave. So we can see this clear motion of going up a fifth each time. And if we look at the Roman numeral content, we can also see that, where we see something built off of a 3 chord, D major, moving toward an A natural chord, and then an A natural chord moving toward a chord built off of E natural, and then a chord built off of B, which is our tonic, and then F sharp being our dominant overall as a final sort of goal. Notice a lot of this doesn't look like it's going to be cast into parentheses. It's kind of truncated. It's shortened because it starts on scaled, or it starts on a 3 chord and moves quickly toward a dominant harmony. So that's what we expect to find in an ascending step and also in an ascending fifth sequence. But each time the interval of transposition is the same, ascending step. And in terms of the harmonic motion, in this case, we see it moving by a fifth, ascending by a fifth each and every single time. And this one goes across the bar line too, which is useful to understand. That's a very common sort of way that this sequence is articulated. And then, just for the sake of completeness, here's what this progression sounds like in 4-part writing. So then recapping once more. Sequences in general, a series of non-functional harmonies governed by an intervallic pattern, an LIP. Specifically, ascending fifth, we're talking about a model to copy relationship going up a step. So it's similar to ascending step, ascending 5-6 progressions, where we see the whole entire model getting transposed up a step. So the interval transposition is the same. But what's different about ascending fifth compared to ascending step is that every harmony in ascending fifth is moving up by a fifth or descending by a fourth. So in this way, ascending fifth is the inversion of a descending fifth progression, where each chord is what the sequence is describing. Descending fifth, we're talking about each chord going down a fifth. Ascending fifth, we're talking about each chord going up a fifth. And then descending third and ascending step, we're kind of talking more about model to copy relationships, which is how they differ in these sorts of analytical methodologies.